Here we are again for lecture 23. Today we're going to talk about manifest destiny and Indian removal. So with nothing further ado, let's get on. This is going to deal with the essential question of analyzing the causes and consequences of the American concept of manifest destiny. And this deals with key concept 4.2.1. Of course, we're going to specify one major consequence here, and that is consequences to Native Americans. We will specify Mexicans in North America later on. So let's move on here, and we're going to just move in. Now look, the major impetus for manifest destiny, and for what we're going to define as manifest destiny in just a moment, to really understand manifest destiny, we have to take a closer look at the Louisiana Purchase. Now, of course, as you recall, this was a purchase made by the United States from Napoleon of France in 1803. He had acquired this territory from Spain, and ultimately he sells the territory because he's not able to extend his empire into this area, and he needs money for fighting his wars with Britain and the coalition in Europe. So he sells Louisiana territory at a relatively decent price, and now the impact of this was tremendous in the United States, because now, I mean, take a look at this. The Louisiana territory pretty much doubles the size of the United States. And it creates a huge, tremendous amount of moving space, kind of elbow room for Americans at this time. So there's all of this potential. So the United States started to see themselves as a nation of potential. And also we have to understand that this is relatively quick. So the United States, as it stood during the time of the Articles of Confederation, was just this thin little strip of area here. Let me get my magic pen out. Just this thin little strip of area here on the eastern seaboard, and yet within 20 years, all of this land is going to be acquired. The South, what was then called the Southwest Territory, will be acquired from Spain, and then bam, we have this huge territory is added to the United States. This was done within a generation. This was done within 20 years. So it sure looks like the United States is just bound. If you look at the trajectory, if you look at the path, it's really not hard to think that within the next 20 years, the United States is going to span the entire the whole span of North America. Holy cow! The idea of from sea to shining sea. It was pretty well understood by Americans that during this time that it was not unreasonable to think that all of North America at one point would be the United States of America. So this is a huge impact on American culture and on American foreign policy at this time. Now, of course, all of this land was relatively unexplored by Americans, so Thomas Jefferson pulls together two gentlemen, Meriwether Lewis and Richard Clark. And these guys, by the way, couldn't stand each other. They really didn't like each other at all during this time. But their job is going to be to explore the Louisiana Territory. And ultimately, the results of this, I mean, they will explore the Mississippi River. They'll even explore into the Oregon Territory. And this is going to give us tremendous knowledge of the region. What resources are out there. Of course, a lot of people, expressed that this was largely a large wasteland. And there were some areas there that were pretty questionable, what was known as the Great American Desert. But that wasn't all that was there, and Lewis and Clark were able to explore much of this and really eke out what are the resources that are there. It also brought, the United States into, they weren't supposed to go into, but they went into the Oregon Territory. And now we're going to actually set up a means by which Americans are going to be able to extend themselves into the Oregon Territory. And this is going to be a bit of an issue later on. We ended up Interestingly enough, for probably the first and only time in our history, we ended up with relatively decent relations with the Native American people that lived in Louisiana. Unfortunately, we also brought some of our diseases with us. But either way, for a brief period of time, we did have some pretty decent relationships with some of them. Of course, we remember the famous Sacagawea, who traveled with and helped Lewis and Clark out on their expedition. And we also see that that Lewis and Clark are going to make relatively decent maps. And if you can map out the area, this opens the area up to further exploration and to further kind of exploitation. Moving in and parceling out these lands and making plans for these territories. So this was a tremendous thing. So all of a sudden, the United States, Americans have this huge territory. It sure does look like Napoleon may have been right, as is attributed to him as saying that he has put a backbone into a very large jellyfish. Now this is, of course, since we've acquired all of this land relatively quickly, and there's a demographic shift of Americans moving westward. It was during the early 19th century that the center of the American population is going to cross the Appalachian Mountains for the first time and find itself in the Ohio Valley. And this is going to bring about a concept that Americans feel that they pretty much have a destiny to move themselves west. This idea that ultimately all of this territory is going to belong to the United States by right, which is going to be a term coined as manifest destiny by our friend here, John L. O'Sullivan. He will write about American expansion into the West as being a manifest destiny. In other words, think about the term. Again, we're going to do a little magic pen here. Manifest destiny, okay? It is basically predetermined by God that the United States, having such an amazingly wonderful culture, is destined to take over and bring their American civilization over the entire continent and create a great nation. This was a manifest destiny. It was a God-given destiny. And if it's a God-given destiny, well, who's to argue with God, right? Well, there was more than God that was influencing this. Well, let's take a look at John L. O'Sullivan anyway, where he says, away, away with all these cobweb issues of the rights of discovery, exploration, settlement. The American claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty. Providence, all right, we're looking at divine providence. We're looking at the will of God here, and that's going to play a crucial role in much of American history. But again, as I started to say earlier, it's a little bit more than God involved in this process of manifest destiny. In fact, during this time, we were developing an overall understanding of ourselves as a nation, and that it was probably common sense that we were going to want to spread our nation and make our nation larger and stronger. So it wasn't necessarily just a duty to God, but it was also a duty to country to expand American power and prestige westward. There was also a tremendous amount of population issues going on. Birth rates were relatively high. We were relatively prosperous, so our mortality rates were a lot lower, and we had this huge influx of immigrants coming into the United States. Some of them, like the Germans in this early period, are looking for farmland. They're looking for places to restart their farms after being displaced from Germany. So we have these population pressures that are going on. These populations are moving into places like New Orleans and New York and expanding those pressures out there. And the Louisiana Territory kind of gives us a release valve to kind of loosen the load on some of these population pressures. We also look at the prospects of economic development. We see the Louisiana Territory, we see the West as an investment, something that we can make money from. There's resources out there. There's timber. There's minerals. There's metals. There's land. There's a lot of stuff that we can actually invest in. Technological advances are also going to be a part of this. Now, up until this time, for instance, the Americans and Native Americans were largely equal as far as their technological advancement and being able to defend their territories. But now, Americans are going to see themselves being able to travel faster and more efficiently than ever before, and bring lighter, more efficient weapons with them. So when we talk about the Texas Rangers, we'll talk about the Colt, pistol, and some of their advances there as well. And also, there was this idea, this kind of a missionary zeal, or these reform ideals, to go out into this wilderness where the savages live and bring our civilization into those areas and to make them better, to make them civilized places. Of course, those folks may have thought that they were civilized, but clearly they were wrong, at least as far as the Americans were concerned. So you had all of these things going on with regard to supporting Manifest Destiny, and you really only had one argument against, and that was the expansion of slavery, which we talked about earlier. Many people, especially folks in the North, activists in the North, were a little bit concerned that slavery would spread itself into the West and become a bigger phenomenon and a bigger scourge on American culture than it was. Now, the thing about spreading yourself into other territories is you kind of have to understand that usually there's already people living in those territories. There's somebody standing in the way. And if you are going to move in, they are going to have to move out or be displaced in some way, shape, or form. Today we're going to focus on Native Americans. And we'll focus on the things that happened to the Native American cultures as the United States was expanding westward. But we also can't neglect the fact that much of the territory outside of Louisiana was Mexico. And in fact, we didn't necessarily have a sure border between the United States and Mexico, or the United States and the Spanish colonies. So we'll get into that conflict a little bit more in depth later on. But what we want to talk about right now is Native Americans and what was referred to at the time as the Indian problem. Now, early Indian policy didn't really have to do with the Louisiana Territory. If we take a look at this map here, we will see that this is the Mississippi here. So that meant Louisiana. This is Louisiana, and this is the United States. Well, early Indian policy focused on those groups that were part of and inside the United States. So we could take a look at the Chickasaw and Choctaw territory. We could look at the Cherokee and Creek territory, and also Seminole territory that existed during this time. I don't know why Choctaw and Creeks didn't light up, but that's okay. These tribes, these were the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole, were considered the 5 civilized tribes. And why? Well, for the most part, during this time, Jefferson established the first real Indian policy, and he thought goal 1, let's civilize these Native American tribes. Again, these Native American tribes, they considered themselves already civilized. But of course, that's not the perception of Jefferson. So we want to civilize these tribes, bring them American agriculture and trade and stuff along those lines. But ultimately, let's encourage, in fact, strongly encourage, and dare I say, maybe even coerce a little bit, encourage these Native American tribes to move westward into this vast Louisiana Territory. Jefferson saw this as a great opportunity to set land aside for Native Americans that they could keep and cherish for as long as the grass grows and the river and the waters run, or about 10, 20 years. Whatever came first. But this was an opportunity that Jefferson saw to actually kind of help the Native Americans out-ish. On the part of the Native Americans, they had a couple of options. One of those options was to assimilate, to accommodate themselves to the American civilization. And that's what these 5 civilized tribes, for the most part, did. The Seminole were a little bit questionable, but for the most part, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Creeks, and the Cherokee, and to a smaller extent, the Seminole, were going to, accommodate themselves to European and Euro-American standards and cultures of doing things. Many of them had very productive farms and herds and things along those lines that they were keeping. So they wore Western dress and Western style, and they were fluent in English. These were these were tribes that had largely decided to accommodate and just live like the Americans were living. And then, of course, there were those who decided that it was in their best interest to resist this influence. So I'm going to pause right now while the announcements are on. Okay, I'm back. I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now, we've already talked about the Pan-Indian military resistance movement, to this idea of Indian removal. But ultimately the goal is we got to get these Native Americans out of this land, especially these very valuable lands out here in what was then the Southwest. Especially when gold is found in them our hills. That's going to be a real problem. So now when we take a look at this becomes an actual policy, mostly under Andrew Jackson and later presidents. This policy of Indian removal. The real problem was that there was a huge conflict going on at the time between federal power and states' rights with regard to Native Americans. Remember that age-old debate between what were the limits of the power on the federal government and what was the extent of the power of the states. Now remember, under George Washington, this had largely been resolved, right? It was through the Intercourse Act that the federal government was going to take charge of dealing with Native Americans. Well, that's all well and good, but take a look at this map. The folks of Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama are thinking, well, wait a minute, no. We want to get these Native Americans out of our territory, out of our lands, and we should be able to do that. So they start to encroach and infringe on Native American tribes, and the federal, and they almost challenging the federal government to do something about it. But the federal government wasn't going to do something about it because the president at that time was Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson, we saw before, had already stood up for the powers of the federal government and was definitely a strong central federal leader at that time. However, not if you happen to be Native American. Jackson did not particularly care for Native Americans and was not willing to come and use his federal power to protect Native American groups. And in fact, ultimately a law will be passed called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which is going to allow the states to kick their Native American tribes out of the country. Now, this actually was ruled on by John Marshall in the Supreme Court in a couple of cases, the Cherokee Nations versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia, in which the Supreme Court said, "Oh, wait a minute, no, you can't do that. You have a treaty with these native tribes, and according to the Constitution, you have to abide by that treaty. That treaty becomes the law of the land." So the Native Americans are right, you are wrong, you have to let them stay in their lands. To which Andrew Jackson is said to have replied, "Mr. Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it." That's a problem, because it, of course, is the job of the president to enforce the laws. And if the president decides he's not going to enforce the laws, that's a real problem. Ultimately, the Cherokee will be removed. The Choctaws and Chickasaws, many of those guys had already left. The Cherokees were the last holdouts, and they were hoping, as civilized people would do, to resolve this in the courts. Not going to happen. And that moment where the Cherokee are removed from their tribal lands in Georgia to faraway Oklahoma, a passage that was escorted by about 7,000 American soldiers and ultimately resulted in the death of about a quarter of the Cherokee people who went on that trek. This was known as the Trail of Tears, one of the lower moments in American history, in my opinion. There was still resistance to this, of course. In Illinois, there was the Black Hawk War that lasted a little time until the Sauk Indians were put down, and Black Hawk himself was imprisoned. There were also the Seminole Wars, which lasted for 8 years, and was fought by one of the more brilliant military leaders of his time, a fellow by the name of Chief Osceola. And Osceola was largely undefeated, and no matter what the Americans threw at him, he always managed to outmaneuver the American military. But ultimately, he will be captured while under a flag of truce and imprisoned, and will die in prison as a result of diseases that he got inside the prison. And the Seminoles will kind of back off. Many of them do travel to Oklahoma. Many of them back off into the kind of the backwoods of the Everglades. But no, they never are going to sign a treaty with the United States, interestingly enough. Also, too, not all Americans were in favor of Indian removal. In fact, there was a huge movement against Indian removal and against the immorality of Indian removal. In fact, the very first national female petition drive in American history was a petition drive for the benefit of maintaining the tribal integrity and the tribal lands of Native Americans. So again, women were at the forefront of these social movements. Now I'll leave you on this with a quote from probably one of my favorites, historian Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was a historian who believed that historians have a function in that we should be using our knowledge to the benefit of liberation, and pointing out the sorrows of history to a certain extent. And he writes, Indian removal, as it has been politely called, cleared the land for white occupancy between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, cleared it for cotton in the south and grain in the north, for expansion, immigration, canals, railroads, new cities, and the building of a huge continental empire clear across to the Pacific Ocean. The cost in human life cannot be accurately measured, in suffering, not even roughly measured. Most of the history books given to children pass quickly over it. We don't like looking at this moment in history of Indian removal. It is an embarrassment at the very least. At the most, it is an admission of tremendous, tremendous guilt. Now, every historian has to make up his or her mind on how he or she wants to treat this history and why we actually study history. Are we using this knowledge for the purpose of liberation and for freedom, or are we simply just expressing and trying to reinforce our values? This is a huge debate. I don't necessarily have the answer to you. I'm pretty sure Howard Zinn would be able to give you his answer if you read his histories. But it is up to you as future historians, presumably, to decide what is the approach that you want to have to history. And, of course, it is then your responsibility to be honest about it. But one thing it is not. It is not your responsibility as a historian to be polite. Anyway, that's it. Relatively quick, so have a good day.